Can you stay awake for 15 days? It sounds pretty easy. Just don't sleep for 2 weeks, and you're good. But what if I told you that scientists actually did this to volunteers, and they even paid them $10,000 for it? The volunteers stayed awake by pushing through hallucinations, talking to the dead and harming themselves. And at the end, one of them didn't want to leave the chamber they had been locked in. So the question is this real or just a creepypasta? It was a cold night in San Francisco on November 2008, when the 4 volunteers walked into the Sleep Research Center at the University of California. They were going to take part in a study where they would be locked up for 15 days straight without sleep. But it was all in the name of science, and they were gone. Get paid $10,000 for it. In fact, the experiment was designed by Dr. David Dinges, who was determined to find out how long a human could stay awake, and what kind of effects it would have on their brains. And after testing many subjects, he believed that he finally had the perfect group of test subjects. There was a man named Tom, a woman named Beth, and 2 other participants whose names we don't know. And while Tom was excited to take part in the experiment, there were some rules that he and the other volunteers had to abide by. For example, they couldn't eat or drink anything that would stimulate them. And if they started hallucinating, then they would have to keep the other volunteers in the same room aware of it, so no one would get hurt. But almost immediately, things went wrong. On day 3, Tom began hallucinating bugs crawling on the walls and ceiling. But before long, he started seeing other things as well, including visions of his deceased mother. And on day 4, Tom's hallucinations got so bad that he started swatting at the air and even cut himself with a shard of glass. And according to the researchers, this was a pivotal moment in the experiment, because Tom was hallucinating bugs that only he could see. But he also started claiming that he was hearing voices and that some of the people he saw walking past the window were actually zombies. And while everyone else in the room thought Tom was losing his mind, he became more and more agitated until he started screaming. That's when the researchers decided to bring in another doctor to evaluate Tom and determine whether or not he should be allowed to continue the experiment. But when the other doctor entered the room, Tom lunged at him and scratched him across the face. And that's when the researchers realized that they had made a terrible mistake. Tom wasn't just hallucinating, but he was experiencing something far more sinister, and they needed to stop the experiment immediately. In fact, they were so concerned about Tom's mental state that they called off the experiment early on day 6. But before they opened the chamber, they noticed that the other volunteers, Beth and the 2 others, seemed unfazed by Tom's behavior. In fact, they appeared to be fine and wanted to continue the experiment. But the researchers wouldn't allow it, and they opened the chamber. As the door opened, Tom ran out and collapsed on the floor. He had suffered a complete psychotic break and had to be taken away in an ambulance. But the other volunteers refused to leave. In fact, they begged the researchers to let them stay in the chamber for longer. And this is where things get really creepy, because it turns out that the longer someone stays awake, the more susceptible they are to suggestion. And the researchers believed that Beth and the other 2 volunteers were now under the belief that they were being monitored to make sure they were safe. Which was true, but they didn't know that. In fact, they believed that the researchers would keep them in the chamber for the rest of their lives and feed and water them so they never died. And that's why one of the volunteers begged the researchers to seal him in the chamber forever. But of course, this never happened, and all 4 volunteers were eventually released. However, the experiment had a profound effect on their minds, and they never really recovered. So the question is this real or just a creepypasta? Well, it turns out that it's actually based on a true story. The details have been fictionalized for the sake of the story, but the experiment really happened. However, it's important to note that the researchers didn't do this to make a creepypasta. They genuinely wanted to learn more about sleep deprivation and its effects on the human brain. But as you can see, sometimes ignorance is bliss. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already.